Hello, and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. And today we have a very special episode for you. Cue emotional sitcom music. First of all, Pat Wyman is here, as always, and we are also joined today by Phil Mackenzie at Evil Greg Jackson, who you may know from the Underdog series on the Heavy Hands Patreon. Phil, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. And why is today a very special episode? Pat, I suppose the way to address this topic is to maybe have you tell Phil and our audience what you told me after Jacare Souza versus Kelvin Gastelum a few weeks, probably about 2 months ago at this point. What was your experience with that fight?
It was a great fight, and I couldn't get myself to care about it.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I've been at with MMA for a little while now, and it feels like that's not really changing, at least as long as I'm covering it very often. So I think it's probably time for me to step away from the sport completely. I haven't been writing about it that much in the last few months, and it feels like I'm doing a disservice to you guys, both to my co-host here and to the audience, if I'm not invested in it. I feel like that it harms my analysis and makes the show less fun to listen to. So for your sake, as well as mine, I think it's probably time for me to step away a little bit.
Well, the content has been top notch still, Pat. I think I never question your ability to produce content, but Pat's a very busy man, and I think we kind of knew that at some point you were probably going to be parting ways with the show, and it's a sad day, but really it's kind of a happy one for you because I think you finally realized what we all know, which is that MMA kind of sucks.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of in a weird place right now where we're just starting to get some big fights, but the big fights that are really, really interesting are kind of few and far between. And the stuff the problem is not getting up for big fights. The problem is not summoning the enthusiasm to discuss UFC 225 or UFC 226, which is coming up next week, which will be previewing that will be the last show that I do. The problem is really getting down to dig into the nuances of UFC Singapore or the cards in Boise and God knows where else that are happening after UFC 226. I just don't have that in me anymore.
Yeah.
No hate for anybody who does. If that's still your thing, more power to you. I'm sure that Connor, you and Phil will do a fantastic job of discussing those. I can't do it. I can't do it anymore. I've been covering these cards nonstop for 4 years, and I can't do it anymore.
To our listener children, Daddy and Daddy are splitting up, and it is your fault. But as Pat sort of alluded to, that's why Phil's joining us today. Phil is going to be the new co-host for Heavy Hands, and if you don't know Phil's work or haven't heard much of him before, you can go see him saying funny things over on the MMA Depressed Us. That's on the MMANation.com YouTube channel. And he and I have written a fair number of articles together in the past. Our most recent one, joint article, was a piece on Mike Perry and sort of Platinum as a Commodity was the name of the piece, where we looked at how Mike Perry probably should be taken care of as a prospect and how he is being taken care of by the UFC. As I noted, we do the Underdog series together, and well, Phil, I like your work, and I think you're a very sharp guy, and you seemed like a natural guy to step in now that it's finally time for Pat to leave his gloves in the podcaster's armchair or whatever it is he sits in while he records.
Take me out back like old Yeller. That's what you do with old podcast hosts, is you just take them out back of the barn and put them out of their misery.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I'm incredibly, thankful to be given, the opportunity. Always been a huge fan of Heavy Hands. Like I think I said to Connor, I think I might have listened to every episode of Heavy Hands, or at least
You have told me that you have, which is astounding because I don't remember most of them.
Yeah, so all the way back until it was Connor and the first guy he got to do it, his friend Corey, and then his solo stint, and then the hiatus in which I think I pestered him to bring it back. So. Yeah, I mean, I know I can never really, I can't replace Pat. Those are some seriously big shoes to fill in terms of analysis. Obviously Pat as a huge influence on me, analytically and how I write about MMA. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to it, and you can't blame Pat for being bummed by stuff like Jacare Gastelum, because I found myself watching that and just going, one of these guys is just older.
This isn't interesting. One of them is just young, and the other isn't. Yeah. Yeah. No, the amount of sympathy I have for your decision, Pat, is probably pretty worrying. People listening to the show should try to get out now, because it's no, just kidding. I think the show will persist into the foreseeable future, because I still enjoy doing it week to week. And anyway, Phil, thank you very much for joining us, and let's go ahead.
You guys are going to do a great job.
Oh, it'll be a blast. And really, I did forget to mention the real reason that I chose Phil as the appropriate replacement is that Pat and I have so much stuff monogrammed with our initials. So many letterheads, bath towels, all kinds of stuff. And I figure
matching robes.
Yeah, well, yeah, that goes without saying. And I figure going from a PW to a PM is much easier than most other transitions would be.
Yeah. Just unstitch the W, turn it around, put it back on.
Yep. Real easy transition's going to be nice and smooth. And then as soon as Pat's last episode next week is concluded, that will effectively be a sort of damnatio memoriae. We can just forget that Pat ever existed and pretend that it's always been a PM.
You're chiseling me right off the linen reminders of all the time we spent together.
Chiseling your features off the show. Yes.
Just get some text to speech converter, run it through the old episodes twice, and just replace Pat with a Stephen Hawking-esque robot voice.
It'll sound just like Phil. It'll be like a GPS doing Pat's voice. So anyway, welcome to Heavy Hands. As has been noted, we haven't clearly laid this out. This is Pat's penultimate episode with the show. So next week, our pre-UFC 226 episode, our preview of Miocic versus Cormier, a fight that we are all extremely excited for. I don't even have to ask about that. That is going to be Pat's final show. And because we have a bit of a week off here, we did just watch Cerrone versus Edwards, and, that's a thing that happened. But we have a semi-week off here, an empty weekend ahead of us, and we thought it would be a great time to sort of introduce Phil to the dynamic, and all three of us talk about some great fights from MMA past. And this is, of course, a topic that Pat and I have breached, a couple of times at least. But essentially what we decided to do is have each of the three of us, pick 2 classic fights, and our definitions for what qualifies as a classic fight vary from individual to individual, but we're going to go through them in chronological order and just sort of discuss why these fights are interesting, why you need to watch them, why they are must-see fights for MMA fans, and just have a good time reminiscing about some of the best moments in MMA history. So why don't we'll start with Phil, since he's the newbie on the cast right now. Phil, you picked 2 fights. Do you want to tell people what your 2 choices were and a brief explanation of why?
Sure. So for my fights, instead of going for all-time classics or the best fights that you necessarily want to look, although one of them is you want to see, although one of them is obviously one of those as well.
Yeah.
I picked fights which illustrate kind of perfect game plans and illustrations of how to beat a perfect style, how to beat a style in almost the most archetypal way. So these are fights where, because one of the things about MMA is that it's, from an analytical perspective, it's often very difficult to get a handle on what's going on because it's so chaotic. Mm-hmm. Things keep shifting back and forwards. You can get knocked out from a tiny exchange. It's one of the things which makes it great and protean and exciting, but it's also one of the things which can make it very difficult to tell what was the factor behind a win or the factor behind a loss. And it's difficult to determine things like consistency or stylistic dominance in a lot of senses. So, the 2 fights that I picked were Fedor Emelianenko versus Miko Cro Cop in Pride Final Conflict 2005, because this is, I think, the first real high-level archetype of how you beat a kicker in MMA, of how you pressure and take it away from them. And this is the kind of game plan that we would then see like get replicated in various forms and various strategies down the years, from RDA Pettis through to like Lee Barboza, Holloway Pettis. Like, we've seen this kind of approach be duplicated, and this was kind of the first and one of the best performances in that kind of arena. Second one I went for was Rory Macdonald versus Tyron Woodley, which is, in honesty, in many ways, no one's idea of a classic fight, but in other ways, it is one of the most perfect multi-step game plans for an incredibly. It's one of the most perfectly executed multi-step game plans I've seen in MMA, especially considering like a clear like athleticism disparity between the two fights. It shows you how to. This is a somewhat limited, extremely intelligent fighter on the one hand, and a more three-dimensional but athletically inferior one on the other. How do you solve that problem? And it shows it almost perfectly. So those are my two. Second one, again, not everyone's favorite barn burner fight, but from a tactical perspective, one of my favorites.
I was surprised when I went back and watched that fight for this, how much rewatch value it had, because it was an absolute masterclass. And I can't wait to talk about that one. I'm excited about that.
And it's a very memorable fight. It may not be everyone's idea of a classic fight, but it's a fight that gets brought up a lot. And maybe that's because MMA fans don't really need extra reasons to like critique the championship reign of Tyron Woodley. But people remember when the current welterweight champion was summarily figured out by Rory Macdonald. So I think it's a very good choice for...
Well, it's especially salient because nobody else has been able to do that.
Right, exactly.
Like, it's not like the underlying flaw that led to Woodley getting beaten that way has been fixed. It's just that Rory Macdonald is the only guy who's actually been able to pull that off. So it's, which is interesting. It's a really interesting dynamic.
So Phil went for perfect game plans. Pat, you want to give a brief description of what your two picks are and what your sort of theme or idea was in picking them?
Yeah. So, I picked two exceptionally violent fights. I picked, and mostly because they're just two of my favorite fights. And after rewatching them, I figured out that there were a few strands that tied them together. But the first is Robbie Lawler versus Rory Macdonald 2 at UFC 189. Maybe the best fight of all time in MMA. And the second is Jose Aldo versus Max Holloway 1, their first meeting. And I think that what ties them together is, in both cases, the winning fighter had a lot of figuring out to do of a complex, well-rounded, and very dangerous challenger. So in both cases, the fighter who ended up winning had a lot of thinking to do to get there. They're both back-and-forth fights. There are a lot of layers to them. The momentum shifts are both enormous and small at the same time. Like, there are huge momentum shifts from fighter to fighter, and there are also very small ones, even over the course of an exchange. Like, there's a lot going on in both of those fights, tactically, strategically, and in terms of adjustments, and I think that really stands out about both of them. They're also just fucking awesome fights. They're both really fun to watch.
Yeah. Speaking of a strand holding two things together, thanks for making me look at Robbie Lawler's lip again. Very appreciative of that.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot left there. Jesus.
Very little. And that goes for what I ate for breakfast as well. But as for me, let's see, I picked two fights as well. And I guess my thought process was sort of kind of the opposite of what Phil chose. I went for fights that really did not have somebody who was in all ways clearly better than the opponent. I went for fights that were really marked by their adjustments. So these are bouts that are essentially competitive all the way through, or they are at least defined by constant competitiveness, with neither man able to gain an easy or firm leg up on the other because it's quickly taken away from him, whatever foothold he gains. So my first pick for that theme was Eddie Alvarez versus Yo Keem Hansen from Dream 3. And it's a shame, really, that because of the time I got into covering MMA and when this show started and everything, just didn't have a lot of time to talk about Yo Keem Hansen. But he is one of my favorite fighters to watch. He is a maniac. His style, he's like one of those Carlos Condit fighters whose style only makes sense because he's insanely tough and aggressive and apparently just loves to fight. And he made for a perfect matchup with Eddie Alvarez, despite getting knocked down like 3 times in the first round of this 2-round fight. So that's my first pick. My second one, the second appearance of Jose Aldo on these picks. There's already 2 appearances for Rory Macdonald. Jose Aldo gets his second appearance too. Probably shouldn't surprise many listeners because both Pat and I love Jose Aldo. I went for Aldo versus Mendes too, which remains one of my favorite fights of all time. After getting just friggin' mollywopped in their first meeting, Chad Mendes comes back with the Dwayne Ludwig striking keyed in and gives Jose Aldo everything he can handle and brings out the best of Jose Aldo in the process. And then hopefully this will give us a chance to kind of contrast these fights as we go through them too. How does Jose Aldo handle Mendes versus how he handles Holloway? How does Rory Mac handle Tyron versus how he handles Robbie Lawler? Obviously styles differ between those matchups, but we have a lot of layers to look at. We'll probably have time in this first segment just to cover one of these. But as promised before, we're going in chronological order. So why don't we try to do that here? We're going to kick things off with Fedor Emelianenko versus Miko Cro Cop from Pride. Which Pride was it, Phil? I have written down Shockwave 2004.
Pride Elimination Shockwave 2000. Oh, wait a minute. Pride Final
Conflict 2005.
2005. Yep, that's the one.
Boy, I do not miss the event names because they don't make things any easier. Fedor versus Cro Cop. How do we want to kick this one off, Phil? You named this as the perfect strategy against kickers, or at least the genesis of the perfect anti-kicker strategy. How does this fight begin, and why do you say that?
So it begins with Emelianenko coming forward with very careful, patient pressure. He never forces himself out of position. He constantly tries to shift. He constantly shifts over to his left, away from the straight and the left kick of Cro Cop, and simply just walks him down in a circle. And there are, so in perhaps a modern kind of standpoint, you might want him to cut the cage more, but in some ways, all he's doing is saying, I know that Cro Cop is fundamentally a left-handed fighter. He's never really thrown much off his right side at all.
Yeah.
So he just stays in the safe place and just walks Cro Cop down until he is stuck against the ropes and then unloads. And this is kind of the it's such a simple thing. Just stay out of the arc of the kick and just walk them down. But it's something that we've seen like paying enormous dividends as like recently as fights like Rockhold Bisping. Like there was suddenly just a solution. Just stay out of the arc of his left leg, walk him down, push him back.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll see when we do get to Lawler Macdonald. Like, this is not a style of fighting that has lost its effectiveness at all. It's kind of the way that Robbie approached Rory in the first round of their fight. Pretty methodical pressure from Fedor, not cutting off the cage. But I guess the reason why this is like the ideal tack to take against a kicker is the fundamental truth of kicking is that it's much, much easier to do when you are moving forward. And kicking off the back foot is difficult. Kicking while retreating is, for many fighters, nearly impossible. As awestruck as like UFC commentators remain to this day when someone effectively punches off their back foot, kicking is genuinely that hard for a lot of fighters to do while retreating. Marlon Moraes is one of the only fighters active today I can think of who effectively kicks while retreating.
It's not even that common in kickboxing or Muay Thai to be able to kick really well off your back foot.
It's mechanically very difficult to do.
Yeah, it takes a lot of practice, a lot of balance, a lot of strength, which even prime Cro Cop really did not have. But so I think that there's the second component to what Fedor did in this fight that I think is remarkable is not only did he pressure and take away opportunities for Cro Cop to throw, but every time Cro Cop threw, he punished him. There were no free shots in this fight. There were no free actions. There was no point where Fedor let Cro Cop seize any momentum or initiative at all. Because Cro Cop, as in his prime, he had this, and he has this in common with a lot of guys with fairly similar skill sets. Everybody from Anthony Pettis to kind of even guys like Edson Barboza are also like this. Is just that like they kind of rely on you to be afraid of them, and they have some tools for dictating things themselves. But really, it's all about the fear. It's all about you getting the idea into their heads that you are not to be fucked with. And Fedor just refused to buy into that dynamic at all in this fight. You know,
there was one moment, and it speaks exactly to what you were just saying, where Croco managed to force him backwards, and I think and then suddenly he can open up, and suddenly he can throw kicks after punches, and he's suddenly, for a brief moment, Fedor is threatened, but because Cro Cop has to come forward, he ends up putting himself into a takedown situation, and that's pretty much the end of the round for him. Like he spends the next 5 minutes just getting steadily beaten up. But yeah, it speaks to it exactly. Like he just made sure, and he did what you guys have mentioned a lot in the past as well, which is that Fedor would kick with Cro Cop. Not much, but he'd when he was moving with him around the cage, he would occasionally just kick the trailing leg because there was nowhere for it to go at that point.
Yeah, and if Cro Cop is going to be constantly retreating to try to get kicking range, then here you go. Here's kicking range, and now you've been hit, and now I'm suddenly pressuring again. It's a really nice, like, I don't know, a holistic approach to anti-kicking from Fedor in this fight. I want to say too, and we'll see this again when we look at Lawler Macdonald, but I think it's the slow start, the not cutting off the cage, all these things you could potentially critique as tactics. I think like strategically, it's still kind of a perfect performance from Fedor, given the opponent he was facing, because it really, really balances stamina concerns, especially at heavyweight, with the duration of the fight. This was a 20-minute bout, a 10-minute first round, and 2 5-minute rounds following. And like Fedor didn't have to push the pace too much too early, but he also he sort of let Cro Cop dictate the pace and then built on top of that. Cro Cop had to throw to get Fedor off, and then he would be punished. By the time the second round rolls around, it doesn't even take that long. Both men are tired, but Cro Cop suffers more for the loss of stamina, and I think that is, I don't know if Fedor had this in mind, but kicking is harder to do than punching. It takes more energy, and there's a lot more mass to move around and much more careful maintenance of balance during the technique. It's just more taxing. And if your most dangerous weapons are your kicks, it kind of stands to reason that having a fight where your stamina is being winnowed down is going to have a worse effect on you than it does on the methodically pressuring opponent, who's happy to just stay on top of you on the ground and throw short punch combinations and otherwise just kind of do nothing until you finally recover enough energy to try another kick, at which point he punishes you. I love this performance. I've brought up this fight before on the show, I'm pretty sure, right? Pretty recently. I think this.
We just talked about it at great length, maybe a month or two ago, or a couple months ago.
And I don't mind doing it. I don't mind doing it anytime, because it is a perfect approach to a relatively limited but exceedingly dangerous fighter like Mirko Cro Cop. And to think too, I want to give historical context. This at the time was mind blowing. Pat and I just talked last week about how our understanding of style matchups is changing. This was full on in the era of grappler versus striker, and that is how this matchup was viewed. And the amount of time that Fedor spent on the feet with Cro Cop and how dominant he was there, especially as the fight went on, was mind blowing to MMA fans at the time, who expected the only way to beat Cro Cop is to grapple him, and Fedor beat him everywhere.
Yeah, this was one of the very first fights that showed MMA becoming something more than a clash of skill set archetypes, right? Where you could have skills in many different areas, and suddenly it was about things like directionality of movement and where in the ring or cage do you want to be fighting? How are you going to blend your skill sets together to make them worth more than the sum of their parts? You know what it reminded me of a lot. Another fight that happened kind of around the same time that also fit into that stylistic evolution was Shogun Nogueira.
Sure.
Same kind of thing where you had what was supposed to be a kind of a striker versus grappler matchup, and instead it turned into one where Shogun was hitting lateral drops and Nogueira was doing things on the feet, and it turned into this incredible back and forth war. But this happened at this very particular moment in MMA where you had a whole bunch of very talented fighters in the prime of their careers growing from fight to fight, and in an environment where they were getting huge financial incentives to do so.
Mm-hmm. That's why Fedor holds up, man. He really does look like a modern fighter, just with a slightly different style. But the way he thought about the game was very, very modern. So, okay, that's our first pick, and hopefully you did this after the last time we discussed it, or the probable time before that, because I must have brought this up multiple times. It is one of my favorite fights ever. If you haven't seen this fight, go watch it. You have to watch Phaidor versus Cro Cop, and you have to carefully study it if you want to understand how to undo the basic pieces of a kicking game plan in MMA. So with that, why don't we take a break? When we come back, we are going to get into the next 2 or 3 fights on our list. Again, we're going in chronological order here. So fight number 1 was Phil's pick. The next one is mine, and that will be Eddie Alvarez versus Yo Keem Hansen from Dream 3. If you want to pause this, watch that fight before you listen. If you want to watch it after, if you want to, I don't know, see if anything syncs up, if you play both this and the fight at the same time, do whatever you want. But Eddie Alvarez versus Yo Keem Hansen is up next. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Again, I don't know why I should reintroduce you to the topic. It's not like you're listening to this on the radio, but if you forgot what just happened, or for some reason decided to jump 26 minutes into the episode, we're talking about classic fights. Each of the 3 of us, Phil, Pat, and I, picked 3 fights. And next one up on the docket, Yo Keem Hansen versus Eddie Alvarez, or I suppose I should say Eddie Alvarez versus Yo Keem Hansen from Dream 3 in 2008. First of all, these blue gloves, and it just made me yearn for the brief period of time when Dream was a thing. And it was like everything that Pride was, except somehow a little weirder and better. And I still miss it, you know. I guess Ryzen offers some of that same level of bizarre excitement, but this fight brought me back a little bit to the beginnings of my MMA fandom. Had you guys seen this one before?
Yes, I believe it.
Many years ago. I think I watched this in kind of a daze when I was getting through the entirety of Japanese MMA. Like my roommate, when I first got into MMA, had watched all of this stuff, and so we would stay up to watch Dream when it broadcast, or we would watch replays. And I was like, this is just wild. This is just insane shit. Like, remember Alistair Overeem in some of those like 2009 Dream shows, just murdering like Kazuyuki Fujita? And, Jesus, who was the guy that he guillotined off of his feet?
Let's see. He fought Todd Duffy back then. He also fought Yuerton Teixeira, a Kyokushin guy from Brazil. I don't know who he guillotined. I think he hit Yuerton Teixeira with like the knee from hell.
Yeah, that was the Uber knee.
Oh my god. Yeah, scary time for MMA fans. I want to point out first, before we get into this like how this fight played out, this does sort of solidify why so many people are now on the Eddie Alvarez is the greatest lightweight of all time trip, because this is in 2008, and Eddie Alvarez is like still at the top of the game, and it's 10 years later. So that bears repeating and remembering, I think. But let's go ahead and talk about the fight. This one is not defined by any amount of great strategy. In fact, I would say of the 2 I picked, this is maybe the most opposite of your theme, Phil, because neither guy seems to have a really good idea in this fight of where they are headed in the long term. And I think in part because of how effectively a lot of their moves are answered by the games of their opponents. Such that if for each guy, if one little thing was different in how they were put together as fighters or how they liked to fight, if their styles were just slightly different, then this could be a very, very different fight. Like, for example, the one that stands out, if Yo Keem Hansen could stop a takedown, this could be a very, very different fight from the one that it ends up being.
Or if he didn't have that magnet in his chin, or Eddie's right hand, that he only remembered to deactivate about 10 minutes into the fight.
Yeah. So this one starts off, Eddie Alvarez almost immediately knocks Hansen down. They trade right hooks. And then he hurts him a little bit later, and then he knocks him down again. But the funny thing is like, this fight to me is just a series of rebuffs where both guys can get something done, but they both have a ton of trouble advancing beyond that point of turning one node into another. So every single time that Alvarez knocks and or takes Hansen down to the ground, he has to deal with one of the most underrated guards in probably in MMA history. Yo Keem Hansen is a very, very tricky grappler. And again, it bears reminding people that he competed quite well on the ground with Shinya Aoki before notably knocking him out in one of their fights. He's got a really tricky, aggressive guard game. And Eddie essentially is forced into like this rinse and repeat style of wrestling after the knockdowns stop coming, because every time he goes down to the ground with Hansen, he gets tied up and threatened. And as the fight goes on, and as both men get tired, Hansen gets very, very close in some submissions. I think there's an armbar, like almost at the end of the second round, that looks like it's just about locked in, and Eddie manages to sweatily slip his way out of it. But I heard someone about to speak.
Yeah.
I don't know
Well, one of the really remarkable things about this fight to me is how much Eddie Alvarez's offensive game looks very similar to how it looks now. He maybe throws at a better volume. He's maybe got better footwork. His kind of fundamental technique of how he throws punches and kicks is better now. But his instincts are practically the same. He likes to throw more or less the same combinations. He likes to counter pretty much the same way he does now. It's just he's better at it. And also, now he knows defense. He didn't know defense in 2008.
Yeah.
This is not a highlight for defense from either guy.
No, but it's just amazing. Like, it goes to highlight my favorite MMA corollary, which is that defense is the last thing that everybody learns. Like, I don't think most fighters' offensive instincts don't change that much from the early phase of their careers. Like, they want to do pretty much what they want to do from early on, and they may get better at doing that, and they may throw other things in there, but kind of their core offensive games remain pretty solid. But what changes is everything around that and their defense. And like, I challenge you to find a fighter who's 4 or 5 years into their career who knows shit about protecting their chin.
I was just trying to think of an example. Who's that?
For Shane, Shane Burgos is one of the youngest and most defensively aware fights I can think of in terms of like career, but he's not amazing at it.
Yeah.
He's got moves and he's got instincts, but he doesn't have a defensive game.
Yeah. Same as that guy, that other newcomer, Brandon Davis. Like, he has moves, but you can tell when like the fight kind of starts going in a way different than what he expected, he's not actually an amazing defensive reactor.
Yeah. Because Burgos has the young man tendency when he's starting to get hit of just like, okay, I'm just going to get hit more, but then I'm going to hit you harder.
Yes.
And which is incredibly common, and in many ways like a very good thing to have as like a baseline.
Sure.
Just don't give a shit kind of aggression, because that will naturally get sort of, sad to say, kind of beaten out of you over time as you learn more.
Which Eddie Alvarez has. And so it's interesting looking back at this fight and seeing how he's gotten some of those instincts beaten out of him, and others have remained kind of baked into the DNA of his game.
Yeah.
It's also impressive just how durable Eddie Alvarez still is, because he wasn't hyper durable back in these fights. He had incredible recovery, but he's famously one of the guys who gets dropped every single time, and would just he would pop right back up. But this and his fight with Kawajiri, which is incredible, by the way, and I would also recommend anyone to watch. Mm-hmm. Is just an absolute barn burner, but he's been dropped so many times over his career, and he still seems to be relatively in good shape, which is like tribute to his work ethic, but also just to like something inherent within Eddie Alvarez.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far on my physiological trip, because I used to talk about this stuff quite a bit more than I do now. I think Eddie Alvarez bears a lot in common with Mike Bisping, who has also famously just been tagged and dropped many times throughout his career, and didn't really also like went considerably late into his career, still looking like the same guy, in fact, kind of better. He started to maybe lose a little speed, but I don't think Bisping ever became less durable, really. He was always not that durable. I would point out that both Michael Bisping and Eddie Alvarez have absolutely horrible posture, and suggest that may have something to do with the fact that there is just nothing, that maybe they're not actually getting hit that hard, and that's why they're not sustaining this terrible long-term damage that you would expect to see late into like a warrior type of fighter's career, that both guys just don't know how to make it so that when a shot does hit them clean, they don't get hurt. They don't know how to avoid it. So I would suggest that maybe that has something to do with it. Eddie Alvarez's posture is still kind of hurts my back and shoulders to watch him stand and carry himself around.
I'll buy it.
Yeah, I don't know.
Anyway. But yeah, everyone should check out, like, there's that whole era of hyper-violent Japanese MMA. It's all awesome. Like, Kawajiri Alvarez, Max Sakurai, Eve Edwards, all that kind of stuff. All
the best periods of Shinya Aoki's career too.
Yep.
Even Sakurai Diaz was hellaciously fun.
Yeah.
Tail end of the Gomi era. Yeah, it was good times over there in Dream MMA. So why don't we move on? Our next pick is the next pick for a classic fight is from Phil again. And again, chronological order. This one is Rory Macdonald versus Tyron Woodley. I felt like we already talked about it, but we just kind of got invested in looking forward to talking about it. Phil, what do you want to start on with this fight? We've already sort of addressed why it's so memorable, and why, even though it's not a classic barn burner, it still stands out in the mind. Why is this a perfect example of game planning?
So I think I wrote a piece about Rory Macdonald. I can't remember what it was called, but like, it's basically where I basically made the case that I think he's just someone who has an intense, incredible love for mixed martial arts in a way that I don't think really anyone else quite does, and that he seems to love kind of everything about MMA. Like, and I think that's relatively rare, in that he loves wrestling, he loves submission grappling, he loves striking, he loves winning boring fights, and he loves being in crazy, awful, hideous wars, as we're going to see later. He loves everything about MMA, and I think that's what's made him like a genuinely good fighter. Is that I don't think he's like, as I realized this after some time, that he wasn't actually a tremendously physically gifted athlete in any way. He wasn't particularly durable or fast, or I think he's strong, but I think that's largely the evidence of just being in a professional level strength and conditioning program since he was 16. Yeah. Like, but I've never felt like so for this fight, this is not only like a sort of how do you beat a one-handed wrestle boxer kind of performance, of which is the TriStar speciality, but it's one which is made more impressive because the margins are so small. Tyron Woodley is many leaps above Rory Macdonald as an athlete, but his game is still, to this day, is still a little, to me, non-functional, in that he's, tends to back up near the cage and look for the big right hand. But the question of how to solve that, as Pat mentioned, is one which not many people have been able to do, particularly lately. And with Macdonald, he just figured it out. It was that the first thing was that he was just completely unafraid. Mm-hmm. He just pressed forward. He just, not in a kind of blitzing Woodley kind of way, but he just moved forward and carefully forces him into the fence. The second thing is that, as with Fedor, completely prepared for Woodley's main weapon, which is the right hand. So he had that classic kind of tri-star high elbow frame to catch the right hand. So he would just probe with the jab, probe with the front kick, and just steadily start outpointing Woodley. And there was very little that, and so Woodley he's a smart, and the thing is that Woodley may be limited, but he's very smart. That's one of the kind of more underrated things about him as a fighter. So he starts trying things like, trying to counter with leg kicks, but they've obviously trained trigger counters to these. And Woodley is not someone who likes to exchange. I mean, perhaps he could have won that fight if he just, I think he's a solid chance for him to win the fight if he could bring himself to do it would just be to trade leg kicks with punches. Mm-hmm. Because I honestly don't think Rory Macdonald could do that against him.
If he could just bite down and throw at the same time as him over and over again, he probably would have a chance of really hurting Rory before gassing out.
Yeah, I'd say that would take maybe 2 or 3 kicks, maybe a little more, but it's because it's his, he is someone who likes to stay safe. That's why he's built that entire game plan.
The last time Woodley looked really comfortable kind of bombing away and throwing shots was against Nate Marquardt, and he got knocked out. And I think Woodley learned the lesson from that, which is that was not the way that he wanted to fight. And the only other fight after that where he really let his shots go was against Jake Shields. And that against somebody who had absolutely zero chance of hurting him in any meaningful way. And so, since then, that has been the defining hallmark of Woodley's game, and Macdonald figured that out. He's like, if I just refuse to be afraid of him at all, if I play with my distance and I refuse to let him feel safe, then I will win the fight, and I will win it very handily.
Yeah. Phil, earlier, you called this a multi-stage game plan. And that's a thought that I really like. Watching this fight again, you can see that Rory keeps this fight on such a narrow track of what he allows to happen, what he allows Woodley to get away with, and what he's very, very disciplined. He does not allow himself to get drawn into any other kind of fight, and seems to have triggers prepared for essentially every contingency that Woodley can think to give him. So that Woodley does make some attempts to do something different as this fight goes on. He does not just sit there and let himself be picked to pieces, uncontested with his back against the cage. He tries to build in the leg kicks. He tries some of his tricky footwork and rhythm changes. He even, which I didn't remember this from my first time watching this fight, he even starts jabbing with Rory quite a bit in the later stages of the fight. And Rory is just completely, calmly prepared for everything. And so it's I don't know, there's a weird kind of catharsis because watching Woodley fight can be so frustrating, and it's often because the other person just isn't trying to do anything to change the way Woodley fights. And Woodley always deserves some credit for that. But it's very clear, if Stephen Thompson had watched this fight, he could have done different things with the opportunities given to him by Tyron Woodley. And it was
that's what makes this so impressive from Macdonald, right? Is that the dynamic in this fight, in this particular iteration of it, is no different than the dynamic in those Woodley Thompson fights at all. It is exactly the same fight. The difference is that Rory Macdonald was capable of pulling the trigger.
Yeah.
When he was capable of not getting scared off by what Woodley could do back to him. That doesn't sound that impressive until you realize that literally nobody else in all of the fights that Tyron Woodley has had before or after that was able to buy into that dynamic.
Yeah, no one else has fought Tyron Woodley with this approach.
Yeah, I mean, Colby Covington, when and if they fight, is not going to be able to do that safely. He is going to put himself in position to get fucking clobbered. Maybe he can take that shot and maybe he can't. But nobody else has succeeded in playing with that danger in the way that Rory Macdonald did here, because he was always in range. That's the fucking crazy thing about this, is he was never standing 8 feet away from Tyron Woodley and just begging him to cover the gap and give him something to counter. He was right in Woodley's face. He played with the distance. He set it with his jab. He set it with the front kicks. He set it with the round kicks. But he was always close enough that he could hit Woodley.
Yeah, and he knew
in a way that
distance.
Thompson and everybody else who fought him since then never was.
He knew he was feeling that distance, because something that really jumped out at me from the get-go in this fight was how frequently Rory was jabbing without having to step forward. Which is great because he didn't try to step when he knew that he was already in range, which a lot of guys never learn to throw a jab without the step because they're always thinking of bridging that gap. But also just that so many of his jabs just came right off the shoulder or right off the hip. He was there in range. He wasn't on the edge of range, which is often what's really happening when we say that two guys are standing close to each other. He was in range with the guy whose speed and power is supposed to scare everyone away from doing that, and completely controlled how Woodley was able to answer him from that range.
Yeah, a lot of what we say when we say someone is comfortable in the pocket is, I tend to think of it in terms of you tend to think of it in terms of the space around the fighter. So Tyron Woodley and also I think actually Stephen Thompson, they are proximity trigger fighters, meaning there is a space around them which if you step into it, they will suddenly burst out at you. If they're this guy's in range, suddenly I'm gonna, it's it goes from green to red, and it instantly. And Macdonald was able to mess with this very badly just by standing right at the edge of that little bubble of space, and he would just be like, "Am I in? Am I in?" And he would just fence and feint, and Woodley could never quite tell when he'd broken it, and so his distance, but his trigger kept kind of blinking on and off. And he didn't know when to blitz out at him. So in terms of the multi-step game plan, I think that the kind of the greatest part of that is right at the end when Woodley's just I'm going to go after him, as he did against Thompson when he finally had success, when he just decided that he was just going to cover space as quickly as possible, get in there. Macdonald is not going to be able to get back as fast as I can move forward. And he just comes out at him, and Rory just counterblast doubles him. And
everything.
It's just incredibly MMA. It's like making a box out of all these different things you can do in the sport and using them to constrain someone else, and just doing it almost flawlessly.
Yeah. There's one other tactic I want to point out from this fight, because I really like that concept of the bubble, the proximity, and when you're in here, that's when I'm throwing, that's when I can hit you. One of the ways that Rory threw that trigger off, we think of this always in sense of how much nerve it takes to stand in the pocket with Tyron Woodley or someone like him, but it's not just the confidence, the mental fortitude that's impressive from Rory. It's a lot of it is mechanical. Is how his tactics are fitting together. And I love how he doesn't give Tyron Woodley free information. Despite doing a lot of measuring and probing, he does not just fire off his hand into Woodley's waiting palm over and over again, like lots and lots of fighters do when given a defensive opponent. He doesn't. If Woodley manages to touch his palm, he hits him. He quickly comes in and makes sure to hit him in the chin or the belly. His body work in this fight is sensational, by the way. Some of Rory's best ever work to the body. And then when he does get Woodley reacting to something, he has all of these layers that he builds on top of. So he'll hit him with the jab, and then he'll throw a feint jab, and then a feinted follow-up, and then a kick. And then Woodley's like, okay, what about that kick? And then the jab's hitting him in the face again. I just love how in this fight he's not ever allowing Woodley to just get a sense for what that range is. Once he takes away that sense of proximity, he doesn't let Woodley reclaim it. Woodley would have to have worked a lot harder to reclaim that sense of range. And instead, Rory just kind of keeps him in the corner. And
even very good fighters have a tendency to give their opponents information when they're engaging in the kind of game plan that Macdonald used here. Like, that's something should lead us directly into the next fight that we were going to talk about, Aldo Mendes too, because Aldo did give Mendes a lot of free information in that fight.
Yeah, he absolutely did. Do we want to take a quick break before we get into that next one? I think we'll probably do that and get into our next 3 fights in segment 3. You've probably already noticed today's episode is going to be a little long, but we have the kind of fan base where people don't seem to view that as a bad thing. So hopefully you guys are here for 3 more classic fights. We'll see you on the other side of the break. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. Welcome back. Segment 3, and we have 3 more fights to get through. Let's go ahead and jump in. This is my second pick. This is Jose Aldo versus Chad Mendes 2 from UFC 179. Still one of my favorite fights of all time, and not just because Jose Aldo was in it. That's part of it. And I'll be punished for that fandom in a couple more just a little bit later when we look at a certain other fight of Jose Aldo's. But this, to me, this fight is the epitome of like adjustment-focused fights, of fights in which neither man can get a firm grasp on the initiative or the momentum of the bout. Both are constantly answering one another. God, I don't even know where to begin. So okay, I guess the first thing I'll talk about is how the game plans get thrown out the window in a fight like this, where the opponent is responding like with the speed of a fighting computer. Chad Mendes' game plan for this bout was to pressure the hell out of Jose Aldo, under the belief that Aldo would slow down as a result of that, and that Mendes would basically be able to use Brian Stan's favorite semi-word, attrit Jose Aldo as the fight went on. And I think he probably pressures Aldo for like a minute and a half before that seems to kind of go out the window. And that's just in the first round of this fight. He starts pressuring. Aldo almost immediately responds in classic Aldo fashion, which means biting down and throwing with insane force in long combinations. Then he gets dropped by a counter from Mendes, and then I don't know. Like, what do you guys think of this fight? Help me get my bearings, because I'm getting lost in the tactics.
This was such a remarkable fight. And Brian Stan's commentary on it was so good as it was going that he managed to drag a respectable performance out of Mike Goldberg. That's how good this fight was. I can think of no higher praise for it than that. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is I think this will be an interesting contrast when we talk about the Max Holloway versus Jose Aldo fight a little bit later, because Holloway tried a lot of the things that Mendes did, but they worked for him and they didn't work for Mendes. And so Mendes thought he wanted to make Aldo work. And my favorite line of Stan's commentary from this fight, which I also think is some of his best work as a commentator, is,
I know what you're going to say now.
You want to make the champ work. This is how he works.
Yes.
Yep.
And that really summed up all of the problems with Mendes's game plan in this fight, with his approach to Aldo. Was the fight that he thought he wanted was not the fight that he actually wanted or was capable of winning.
Yeah.
He got dragged strategically into a fight that he did not have the depth of skill or range of tools to win. And the difference between him and Holloway, and we can just talk about these as a pair. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, why the fuck not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to do it.
We're free-flowing on this show.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between these two fights is that Holloway actually had the tools to drag Aldo into the kind of fight that favored Holloway rather than favoring Aldo. And it had to do with exchanges and layered exchanges. Basically, Mendes as we talked about before on the show, not in a while, I haven't fought for fucking ever, but Mendes is most comfortable as a counterpuncher. So he wants you to do something, and then he can do something back to you. The problem is when you're fighting Jose Aldo is not going to ever is not genetically programmed to let you have the last word in exchange. Mm-hmm. So you want to counter Jose Aldo, he's going to hit you again. And that's where Mendes got himself into trouble in that fight, right? Was he would draw something out from Aldo and he would do it back. As soon as Aldo figured out that if he just hit Mendes back after that, he would be winning the fight. The strategic sense of the fight had more or less been determined.
Yeah.
Against Holloway, by contrast, Holloway figured out that he could keep the exchanges going, and then Aldo couldn't deal with that anymore, that there was a limit to how deep into an exchange Aldo could go. And Mendes could not reach that same depth.
His plan was essentially to get Aldo to open the floodgates early and drain his energy. And it became clear as the fight went on that he didn't actually do that much thinking about how he was going to swim while the water was rushing past him. You know, he opened the floodgates and he was like, oh shit, I'm kind of drowning. And it became much more of a tactical fight. And in a tactical fight where you're both thinking about what the other is doing and how to respond, that's a very difficult kind of fight to win against Jose Aldo. That is where he excels. And this is an interesting, I was reminded when you mentioned that about a James Toney fight. James Toney fought a guy named Governor Chavers who fought very defensively. And then I remember the commentator saying he decided to hit Toney with a big clean right hand. And it was the worst thing he did in the whole fight because it made James Toney mad and completely he ended up falling into the fight rather than managing it the way that he had probably expected to. But these two matchups are interesting intersections between strategizing, which we've done a lot of talking about, how do you game plan for a particular opponent, and the very difficult to change core of each matchup, which is the style matchup, how these guys naturally like to fight. And Chad Mendes' style is not designed to cope with the Aldo floodgates being opened nearly as well as Max Holloway's is. Max Holloway's style is suited to that strategy, and Chad Mendes' style is, he still hangs in there and does some incredible shit with the best featherweight ever, but it's very clear watching these two fights back to back how much Mendes struggles once he gets the fight he thought he wanted.
Well, one of the major issues is just a boring physiological one, which is just reach. Which is that Mendes has to surge forward in order to hit Aldo. He has to be in combination striking. So whenever he is on the end of a punch, at the end of his shots, he is always in range to get hit back. So in the Aldo Holloway fight, and even more specifically in Aldo Holloway 2, there would be situations where Holloway would draw counters out of Aldo, and Aldo would just punch air. And that happened very much more infrequently against Mendes. And partially it's because, Holloway is a more skilled defensive fighter than Mendes. Partially it is because, in some ways, Aldo Mendes is a phenomenal fight to watch because it is two of the very best fast twitch athletes to ever go at it in MMA, just showing how high the gears they can hit are. Holloway is not that, which is why the whole strategy. One of the reasons why that strategy works better for him. But it's also that Mendes and Aldo always hit each other as hard as they possibly can, and that is not how Max Holloway. That is not how Max Holloway works. Max Holloway is very careful to gradate his power. He's very determined that he will. This is the thing: is that the triggers with Holloway were much harder for Aldo to come by, because he didn't know whether what was coming at him was a throwaway shot or a single tapping jab, or whether it was that huge 3-2 or 1-2 that Holloway starts to throw once he figures that he's got a read. So those are kind of the two major differences to me. It's that like Holloway is a more, I use this word a lot, he's a more granular fighter than Aldo. Aldo has a jab, he has a hook, he has a right hand. Everything he throws is very, very hard. And so Holloway was able to kind of lever smaller shots underneath Aldo's game. Even though Aldo is faster, probably defensively better than him, he was able to lever small little parts of offense in there until Aldo was suddenly didn't quite know when he was supposed to be throwing.
Yeah. And all that built together with Holloway's ability and tendency to fight at a quicker pace, right? So as he started to get all those cues and he started to figure out how Aldo was going to respond to things and how point A led to point B, led to point C, led to point D in Aldo's game, Holloway managed to find those openings. And he did that in a large part by playing with the rhythm, right? He knew that if he did X, then Aldo's response was going to be Y. But then from there, Holloway had a whole flow chart of options, and Aldo was going to key in on what he thought were the most likely ones. So by breaking rhythm and by breaking his shot location, Holloway found a ton of openings in ways that guys never had against Aldo before. Because Mendes was basically a one-speed fighter, as you pointed out, Phil. Like, he wasn't going to be playing with rhythm or timing all that much. He had more or less one speed, and he could mess with the timing a little bit, but he couldn't, but not nearly to the extent that Holloway did, because he did so much less. There was no way for Mendes to set a very strong sense of what the normal rhythm was going to be that he could then break. Whereas Holloway was skipping out on half beats and quarter beats. And there's one sequence where Holloway throws something, Aldo throws back, then Holloway circles out, 2 steps back, 1 step to the side, attacks again, throws something else. Aldo defends, neither shot lands, and then Holloway takes a slight angle, and a quarter beat later, he throws a right hand over the top of Aldo's guard. And it lands. It lands very clean. And you can tell this is in the third round. It's shortly before the beginning of the end for Aldo. But you can see on Aldo's face, he's like, oh shit, I've been figured out.
Sort of the reaction that like Mendes must have had to him. It's like, oh shit, I'm in a fight that I didn't realize until just now I don't actually want to be in.
Yeah, a fight that if you're Jose Aldo, you didn't even really realize existed for you, right? Like that's and it's there's a lesson in here about stylistic evolution over time and about how games have changed, but it's also really just about these two fighters and about the precise way in which they matched up with each other, where Holloway just had tools that Aldo could not imagine having to deal with, and that I'm not sure physiologically or temperamentally he was equipped to deal with, or could have been. I don't know if there's any version of Jose Aldo that would be favored stylistically in a matchup with Holloway.
Well, on that note, I do want to bring up, I think maybe last week I mentioned, we were talking about, I don't know, whenever Mirsad Bektic had his last fight, we were talking about, maybe him getting together with some boxing trainers or whatever. It was funny because just after mentioning that, a friend of the show, Adel Burkic, the best Bosnian on Twitter, he hit me up on Twitter with a video of Jose Aldo, who has been for like the last year or so, maybe the last 6 months or so, been working with Robert Garcia, who trains, Mikey Garcia, formerly trained Marcos Maidana, and is just a fantastic boxing trainer. And even though they were speaking in a sort of pidgin Portuguese Spanish to each other, I knew instantly what Robert Garcia was trying to teach Jose Aldo. He was on the double end bag, and he was just flicking out his punches, popping them from the shoulder, using like his whole body in an almost imperceptibly small movement to drive the hand out so that it takes very little energy at all, and going for speed and relaxation. And he was coaching Aldo through how to do that, because like it's not just Jose Aldo, it's kind of MMA fighters as a whole, I think, don't really know how to do that, which is why Holloway seems so much like a harbinger of something very new in this sport, because a huge difference, as you said here, Pat, but also as Phil like initially pointed out, a huge difference between them is that Aldo just doesn't, at least up to this point, doesn't know how to not throw with everything. Even when he doesn't feel like he's probably putting all of his power into a shot, he doesn't know how to just let a shot go. And Max Holloway does. And at a certain point, it's not just about messing with timing. Like, those shots that you just let fly and they just kind of pop off whatever the target is, they just kind of bounce off of it, those hurt too. They really, really add up. And we saw a good lot of that in the Macdonald fight with Woodley. We don't see any of those shots in Aldo Mendes too. And that is, I think, why Aldo can swim in a fight like that in a way that he just never could, being the fighter he was anyway against Max Holloway. Because like Aldo is built for that kind of fight. He is built for the fight he had with Mendes to the point that like Mendes having to cover that extra distance and not knowing how to do so without putting full effort into it, not knowing how to bridge the gap without just committing himself to a shot. That is primarily what allowed Aldo to turn the momentum around quickly twice in the fight. Like Mendes had some real initiative, especially in the third round when he hurt Aldo with the level change fake to the uppercut and then these big booming, leaping left hooks afterwards. And then like Aldo's still there enough to know that as soon as he moves at me, I should start throwing, does that, and it works because Mendes doesn't have like the calm relaxation to his style. He is, like Aldo, a high horsepower machine. It's all about going from 0 to 60 as fast as possible. And like, I love the contrast between these two fights, as sad as Holloway Aldo still makes me, because it is like watching, Holloway's just so different from what we used to get up to this point in MMA. Watching Aldo Mendes 2 is like watching two stallions fighting. It's all about horsepower. And then watching Aldo Holloway is like watching a horse fighting a camel in the desert.
That has got to be the most complimentary metaphor for that fight.
It's like a horse fighting a camel in the desert. And it's like, oh, the horse didn't cut out for this. And the camel is like the camel's kind of looking like a pretty nice idea for a creature now that I take a look at it. So, yeah, I love these two fights.
It also did, like, I have to say, watching them again did reinforce to me the thought that, like, Aldo is definitely not quite physically himself as he was in the Mendes fight, because the thing is, like, the first two rounds of that Holloway fight are just not very high-paced, and he doesn't take that many shots, and he is so tired by the end of it. I'm not sure what was up, but I know he's. I still think I agree with Pat that I don't think he'd ever. I think I wouldn't favor him over any incarnation of Max Holloway.
Oh no,
but like
neither.
in that first fight, I felt like. Yeah, even at the time, but also on rewatch, it just looks like and that's the issue with these kind of fights, and which we're probably gonna come on to next, is that you tend to leave something in the cage, and that's another sad element of MMA. We'd never see this I don't think we'd ever really see this Chad Mendes and this Jose Aldo again.
Yeah. They may have, from a certain perspective, taken the rest of each other's like primes away from one another in that fight.
Yeah, and which is weird for Mendes because Mendes was only about 6 years into his career in that fight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was a pretty young guy. I mean, we'll see. Maybe a few years off have done Mendes some good.
They may have, because I was worried.
I've missed him. I have to say, like watching this again, like I'd love to see him come back strong.
And I think the major concern, he took a second fight very shortly after that fight with Aldo, and then I think. Wasn't there like a very short timeline between the Frankie Edgar fight and the one before that as well?
Yeah, so he fought Aldo in October of 2014. Basically in 13 and a half months, he had 4 fights, 2 of which were knockout losses, and one of which was the Aldo fight, was that second Aldo fight where he got beat up a lot.
Right.
So he was more or less in camp from August of 2014 until December of 2015.
Some time off could be good. Some time off to nurse his psoriasis and hopefully recover a little bit of his durability as well.
Yeah, so now he's going to fight Miles Jury, who still can't defend a takedown.
Great. It's exactly what I want to see for Chad Mendes. I do still like Chad Mendes. I want to see him win.
Yeah. I just want to see him wrestle fuck somebody and get back in the game.
Get back in the game, that's all.
Yeah. We got one more fight left to talk about. Also on the night of a crushing Chad Mendes knockout loss, Robbie Lawler versus Rory Macdonald 2.
A lot of parallels. This is the second rematch we're talking about, and probably not only because it's your pick, Pat, but because it's probably the greatest fight of all time in this sport. A really good one to end on. This one for you is about emotional highs and like the savage truth of fighting. Why does it give you that message?
Yeah, I mean, so outside of it, like this was a fight that I watched with a buddy of mine who at that point was dying of cancer, and this was the last time that I saw him. It was the last time we got to hang out, so there was that going on at the same time, and he was so into it, and it was such an incredible fight. It was such an incredible night of fights in general. Mm-hmm. But I will always associate those kinds of memories with this fight to start with. But then add to the fact what kind of fight it was, what kind of matchup it was. I mean, there's two guys who already knew something about each other. They already had a pretty good sense for what the other was going to try to do with them, and yet we still got a fight with so many layers to it. The reason I think it pairs nicely with Aldo Holloway 2, or with Aldo Holloway 1, is because in both cases, the guy who eventually won more or less took the first round off and used that time not to do nothing, but to gather information, to figure out what their opponent was going to try to do with them. It's something we should probably start to see more in MMA in 5-round fights, where you can't afford to give away a frame if it's going to give you what you need to win the fight down the road. It's a gamble, but it's a gamble that makes sense. We saw Yoel Romero do that in his rematch with Robert Whittaker. So there was that aspect to it, but basically you had a lot of fights within fights. You had big momentum shifts between the two fighters. You had momentum shifts in the course of individual exchanges. The highs and the lows were just insane here, and you saw both guys over the course of the fight trying to figure each other out and figuring each other out in stages. And eventually it was Robbie Lawler that came out on top of that, but that was mostly because he had just done too much damage for Rory Macdonald to come back from. Like, you could see Rory Macdonald, who hadn't taken all that damage, finding another gear and finding a way to win it later on in the 5th round. It's just by that point, Macdonald's face could not take any more pounding.
Yeah, I mean, that's another one of the stories in Aldo Holloway as well, with the issue of taking, is that you need a phenomenal chin to be able to pull that off in MMA, or you need to be a defensive wizard of the sort that doesn't really, that doesn't really exist in MMA to that extent. There's that Holloway took some absolute bombs from Aldo in that first round. That that running kind of combination that he landed with the left hook into the jump knee. And yeah, so baseline durability has a lot to do with it, but this is again, this is the greatest fight for me in MMA.
I had kind of forgotten before just recently rewatching this how much Lawler took the first round of this fight off. That was the first thing that, obviously it was the first round, but that was something that really jumped out at me. If you were to condense the first 2 rounds of this fight into one big 10-minute round, I think it might look remarkably similar to the first round of that Phaidor versus Cro Cop fight, where Robbie was all about, he was moving away from the power side. He had to deal with Rory's jab the whole time, but he just constantly was trying to get that outside foot position without getting so close that he was running into anything, but without ever backing off enough that Rory got a chance to mentally breathe and think about it. So he was I really like this because he takes the first round off, but it feels to Rory Macdonald that he's working hard, that he is constantly having to address new problems in front of him. And then the way that Robbie kind of sets that pattern in by he's kind of Romero-like, Robbie Lawler. We've talked about his tricky rhythms and everything, but especially when you see him slow the pace down, there are some serious punctuation marks when he does decide to explode and put 2 or 3 really hard shots out there. And he does that in the first round of this fight. It's he just kind of he lets Rory get this rhythm, lets Rory show him what he's going to show him, and does his best to defend most of it. And then I think maybe 2 times in the first round, just leaps in with a big left hand. And from the very beginning of this fight, despite the slow start, he has Rory's nose leaking like a faucet. I love that because it prepares him. I don't know. It kind of preserves him for the war to come in a way that it wouldn't have if he had come out a lot harder and tried to teach Rory a lesson from the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, this was a whole game of kind of move and counter move the whole fight. Like, I thought the way that Macdonald approached this had a lot in common with the way that he approached Woodley, in the sense that he was constantly trying to find the edge of the safe while still taking Lawler out of his fight. Right? He knew that if he didn't try to control the distance, if he didn't jab, if he just tried to turn this into a firefight, he was going to lose it. If he just tried to wrestle Robbie Lawler, he was going to lose the fight because Robbie Lawler's takedown defense was so good. If he didn't put everything together in exactly the right combinations, then he was going to get clobbered. So Macdonald fought a dangerous opponent the way that you should fight a dangerous opponent, which is not to try to take the danger out of it. Right? Like, at no point in this fight did Rory Macdonald have any illusions about getting hit. He knew he was going to get hit, and there was no way to minimize that, right? Like, if he was going to get in the cage with Robbie Lawler in the first place, he was not going to walk out unscathed. And so he didn't put himself in undue amounts of danger, but he also never shied away from the danger in the name of like trying to give himself a better chance to win the fight. He maximized his chances at every point here. The fact that it didn't work out for him was not about him having fought stupid or him having taken shots he didn't need to take. Every shot Rory Macdonald took in this fight was one that he needed to take to try to win the fight for himself. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, the fact that, like, what is kind of shocking in hindsight, given the amount of damage that Macdonald took, is that Lawler, spread out over 21 minutes of fighting, Lawler did not actually hit him that much in comparison to the pace that Lawler had pushed in other fights immediately prior to that. Lawler had.
Oh,
go ahead.
Who's going ahead?
Lawler had worked way faster. Like in the Matt Brown fight, Lawler had thrown a lot more volume. In the Johnny Hendricks fight, both the first and the second ones, Lawler had thrown a lot of volume. In that Jake Ellenberger fight that I was there for, it was just a crushing, brutal loss for Ellenberger. Lawler had thrown a lot of volume. Macdonald managed to shut down a lot of the output that Lawler had shown in previous fights, and yet he still got his face smashed to oblivion. You know, like, I think it goes to show how smart Macdonald's approach was, but also just how good Lawler was and how many answers he had for what Macdonald was showing him.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also worth noting that this is championship Robbie Lawler, right? And this is him defending a belt. And as I've discussed with Connor, and I know you've talked about as well, defending is very different to like being on the hunt for the belt. Mm-hmm. And I've always found it super interesting how much Robbie Lawler's run to the belt, his last run to the belt, was different from anything else that he ever did really in the sport. Because at the end of that first Johnny Hendricks fight, the one where he just gave up the takedown in the 5th round and he just looked at the sky and was like, oh shit. It was just one of these classic, like, the veteran got to the belt and he tried his hardest and he couldn't quite make it kind of performances, right? Mm-hmm. And then he just came out with those fights, like the Matt Brown fight, the Hendricks rematch. What was the other one? Was it Ellenberger as well at the time? Mm-hmm. And he just came out and he just fucked people up. And I always just got the impression that he was just pissed. That he was enraged with himself after all this time of like just, kind of going around, fighting at middleweight, being fat, like fighting grapplers, not learning takedown defense, just fighting because it's a laugh. And that he was like, and then he thought, I'm gonna become the champion now, and he kind of fucked it up in a characteristically Robbie Lawler way. That he was just incredibly pissed off. And I think what you kind of saw once he won the belt was someone who just wasn't that pissed off anymore. He needed to become pissed off in his fights. Like the Condit fight, like this one, even Woodley, for as long as that lasted, he just couldn't find that aggressive gear again, because he was just like, I'm here, this is my place, I'm here to defend this. He wasn't that guy anymore, which was in some ways incredibly smart.
Yeah. Age brings with it clarity, doesn't it? So, like, it telescopes things. So, Robbie Lawler always got super pissed off. But, like, just before his championship run, was the only time he was able to hold on to that rage in a focused enough way that it would like fundamentally change the way he approached fights. Yeah, it's like a super tactical, very intelligent performance, and I don't know, man. I think it's pretty clear. Like, there's so many periods of Robbie Lawler's career you can watch, and in virtually every single one of those periods, but for this one right here, I think this Rory Macdonald would have beaten him. And it was just the perfect Robbie Lawler to stop that from happening.
Yep. It's just such a great fight. The open stance jabbing that you just would never see almost anywhere else. Just people happily exchanging open stance jabs and not being terrified of just getting parried or brushed away. Like the way like Lawler brings on that and brings the right hook back in. The way Macdonald then starts, he's been throwing the right kick up the middle the whole time, and then he's like, wait, I've got an idea. I'm losing this fight. Why don't I try bringing it around the outside? And like right when he's holding up his hand in front of Lawler's face, it's just it's a wonderful fight, and a completely horrifying.
Yeah. Well, I think that pretty much does it for us today. With this episode will be fairly long, but 6 all-time classic fights, and even the one that you noted, Phil, that was maybe not an all-time classic in a lot of people's minds, Macdonald versus Woodley, is a really, really valuable fight to watch. And so if you guys have missed any of these bouts, or if you have any hankering to review them, please go ahead and do so now. We all enjoyed watching them, and we certainly enjoyed talking about them. And we hope you guys enjoyed listening to it all. How the hell do I wrap up an episode of Heavy Hands with 3 people on mic? I don't know how this is actually supposed to work. Pat, you want to tell us what you have coming out this week? This on your penultimate episode with us?
I've just got a second episode on the of Tides of History on the aftermath of the Black Death. So when you kill 50 to 70% of the population with a disease over the course of a few years, what does the world afterward look like, and how has it changed? So I spend solid 50-something minutes talking about that. I think it's pretty interesting, and I think you'll enjoy it if you watch it, or if you listen to it. Jesus.
God, I won't miss this, Pat. These fucking fumbles. I mean, Jesus Christ.
You're a fucking fumble. That's your fumble. That's your fumble right here, Ruebusch.
Phil, are you working on anything right now?
Not anything specific. I've got a bunch of things, running on the back burner at the moment, but nothing I've got coming out this week.
All right. It's going to be great when Pat's gone, and every episode is going to end with both hosts being like, I don't know, something MMA related. Yeah, well, that's where I'm at right now. Just working on various things, but I do want to give a couple of pieces of God, what the fuck am I? Administrative talk. If you are supporting Heavy Hands on Patreon at any level and you are not yet in the Slack chat, send a message to the Heavy Hands Patreon account with your email address, the email address you would like associated with Slack, and we will get you in there. We have upwards of 70 people in there right now, and it's actually pretty hopping. They've got a weekly pick'em they do for UFC cards. They have a whole channel devoted to making up ridiculous nicknames for fighters, which I think we really should start using more on the show going forward. And it's just a fun little chat going on there. So if you want to get in on that and you support the show from the $1 level or up, then make sure to send a message to the Heavy Hands Patreon account, and I will get you added in there as soon as possible. And otherwise, Phil, thank you so much for joining us. Pat, thank you so much for joining us for, I don't know, like 4-something years. And as we said, next week is going to be Pat's final episode on here. Not permanently, I hope. Pat, you'll come back to talk about some fights intermittently throughout the future, I hope.
For sure, I would love to.
Yeah, and whenever there's, just now you get to wait for when it's actually a good card, which next week will be. So make sure you join us. All 3 of us will be here again next week to preview Brad Tavares versus Israel. No, we're previewing UFC 226. Daniel Cormier, Stipe Miocic. How can you not be hyped about that? So make sure you come back next week. All 3 of us are going to be here again to talk about that. And we will bid Pat a tearful adieu and hopefully look forward into a version of MMA that sucks just slightly less. But until that day, Thank you all so much for joining us. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands. This shit is going to go downhill when you leave, Pat, because Phil and I are not going to be able to resist talking about Owen St. Preux and others of his ilk.
That's between you, the listeners, and God.